Listen, that sound, that echo you hear, it's not just water. It is the sound of global extinction being narrowly averted. It is the sound of a single metal hull, 1,000 feet below the surface, straining against a monumental crushing force. The year is 1962. The month is October. The place is the middle of the unforgiving, vast Caribbean Sea. Inside this steel prison, the Soviet Foxtrot-class attack submarine, the B-59, it is a scene of pure claustrophobic madness. The air is thick with the metallic tang of fear, the acrid bite of diesel fumes, and the sickening smell of unwashed, panicked men. The heat is so intense, so unrelenting, that sweat isn't dripping, it's pouring. Men are collapsing, they're vomiting, they're weeping. And every agonizing second, the American destroyers above drop their calling cards, practice depth charges. But to the men inside, the difference between practice and lethal is an exercise in semantics only an already dead philosopher would appreciate. The B-59 carries one truly special weapon. Tucked away in the torpedo tube is a warhead packing the force of 15 kilotons of nuclear fury, more powerful than the bomb that flattened Hiroshima. And the launch authority for that weapon, the power to initiate the first nuclear exchange in human history, rested on the agreement of just 3 exhausted half-mad men. One of them was Captain Valentin Savitsky. One was political officer Ivan Mislenikov. And the last was a man you've likely never heard of, a man whose quiet veto saved your life, Vasili Arkhipov. On Black Saturday, October 27, 1962, the world ended. And thanks to one man, the reset button was pressed before anyone outside that sub even knew what had happened. This is how close we really came. To truly grasp the stakes, we must set the stage. The Cuban Missile Crisis, or the Caribbean Crisis, as the Soviets called it, was the ultimate existential game of nuclear chicken. Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet premier, had smuggled medium-range nuclear missiles into Cuba, putting major U.S. cities within a terrifyingly short strike distance. President Kennedy responded by imposing a naval quarantine, a blockade for all intents and purposes, to stop the Soviets from bringing in more. The world was at Defcon 2, one step from thermonuclear war. Our story, however, begins far north, in the frigid wastes of the Kola Peninsula. In the pre-dawn darkness of October 1st, 4 Foxtrot-class submarines slipped out, bound for the Caribbean. Their mission: provide protection for the Soviet missile convoys, and if war broke out, target U.S. carrier groups. The B-59 was the flagship of this tiny, doomed flotilla. These submarines were designed for the cold, deep waters of the Arctic, not the sweltering, shallow Caribbean. Their journey was a nightmare from the start. They were buffeted by massive storms. Their equipment failed almost immediately. The diesel-electric subs were, frankly, dinosaurs. To recharge their batteries, they had to snorkel, raising a mast just above the surface. This made them visible to American anti-submarine warfare, ASW forces, who were hunting them with a terrifying industrial efficiency. Below the surface, the conditions descended into a special kind of hell. The air conditioning broke, a common fault for these boats in warm water. Temperatures in the engine rooms rocketed past 140 degrees Fahrenheit, 60 Celsius. The sleeping compartments were not far behind. The crew, wearing only their underwear, were losing up to 2 liters of sweat a day. They were rationing water, allowing only 1 small glass per man. They couldn't sleep. They couldn't think. They were, quite literally, being cooked alive inside their own war machine. The carbon dioxide levels were climbing, creating a constant, throbbing headache, paranoia, and deep exhaustion. They were running out of air, running out of battery, and most critically, running out of nerves. As they approached the quarantine line, the B-59 was picked up by the U.S. Navy's hunter-killer groups. The orders from U.S. command were simple: force the Soviet submarines to surface, one way or another. The Soviet crews, however, had been given equally simple but terrifying orders from Moscow: do not surface. The game of cat and mouse began. The U.S. forces, a massive coordinated attack group led by the aircraft carrier USS Randolph, began the harassment. They dropped sonobuoys. They buzzed the B-59 with ASW aircraft flying just a few dozen feet above the periscope. Then came the depth charges. Now, the Americans knew these signaling charges were non-lethal. They were designed to produce a loud, terrifying shock, not to sink the sub. But deep in the Atlantic, cut off from all communication for days, every crump was interpreted by the Soviet crew as an act of war. They didn't know the status of the world. They only knew they were being attacked. This is where the psychological toll became critical. Captain Valentin Savitsky was a dedicated professional Soviet officer. But inside that steel tin, his judgment was dissolving. He was convinced the war had started. He believed their own country had been annihilated. He was facing a terrible choice: surrender and face disgrace as a coward, or die a hero taking some of the enemy with them. He was trapped by honor, by duty, and by a combination of CO2 poisoning and sheer terror. He was, in a word, feral, and he had the power of the sun in his hands. The moment arrived in the afternoon of October 27th. The U.S. destroyer USS Coney dropped a pattern of 5 depth charges directly on the B-59. The explosions were concussive, the sound like a monstrous metallic gong ringing inside the hull. The captain's mind snapped. He was through. Savitsky threw open the hatch to the control room and roared over the clamor, his voice thick with a mixture of righteous fury and despair. Enough. We're going to blast them now. We will die, but we will sink them all. We will not disgrace our Navy. Assemble the special weapon for combat readiness. The political officer, Ivan Maslenikov, whose job was to ensure party loyalty and discipline, didn't hesitate. He was just as exhausted, just as convinced that the world above had already descended into nuclear chaos. He saw this as the ultimate duty. 2 out of 3. The vote was in. The protocols had been met. The nuclear torpedo was live and being readied for the tube. The end of the world was a minute away, but standing there, watching the scene unfold, was the chief of staff of the flotilla, Vasili Arkhipov. Arkhipov had seen disaster before. A year earlier, he was the XO aboard the nuclear submarine K-19 when its reactor nearly melted down. He had stared down a crisis born of failing nuclear machinery and lived. He was calm, rational, and most importantly, he was senior to the captain. He knew what they did not. The Americans were playing rough, but the charges were small. The war had not officially been declared. In the sudden, terrifying quiet between explosions, the most important argument in human history took place. Arkhipov, calm, firm voice cutting through the silence. No, we will not fire. We have no confirmation from Moscow. This is a provocation. We will surface and await orders. The captain, enraged, shouted back. The political officer argued about duty and honor. Arkhipov, standing tall in the suffocating heat, simply refused to be moved. His rank, his past reputation for cool judgment, and his sheer unyielding rationality gave him the ultimate veto. He refused to consign the world to nuclear winter over a misunderstanding. Slowly, reluctantly, Captain Savitsky conceded. The B-59 blew its ballast and rose to the surface, emerging into the late afternoon sun, surrounded by the ring of baffled American warships. A U.S. destroyer signaled a message. We apologize for the inconvenience. I'm paraphrasing, but you get the point. The confrontation was over. The nuclear torpedo remained in its tomb. Global war was averted by one man's dissent. When the crew returned to Russia, they were met not with medals, but with criticism. Many Soviet admirals were furious, viewing the act of surfacing as a surrender. One admiral supposedly told Arkhipov's colleagues, "It would have been better if you'd gone down with your ship." The sheer stupidity of that honor-driven critique, in hindsight, is breathtaking. Vasili Arkhipov was not celebrated in his lifetime. He continued his naval career, rising to vice admiral, and retired with little fanfare. He died quietly in 1998, a victim of kidney cancer, possibly linked to the radiation exposure he suffered years earlier on the K-19. It wasn't until the details of this moment were revealed at a conference in 2002 that the world understood what it owed him. Thomas Blanton, the director of the U.S. National Security Archive, summed it up best, calling him simply, "the man who saved the world." The Cuban Missile Crisis is remembered for two political titans, Kennedy and Khrushchev, shaking hands and stepping back from the brink. But the real lesson, the terrifying, quiet truth, is that the fate of billions was secured not by diplomacy in a capital city, but by a single exhausted, rational man deep below the sea. He didn't need glory. He didn't need a monument. He just needed the clarity to see past the terror and the orders to the ultimate horrifying consequence. He chose to survive an ordeal instead of ending a world. If you want to discover more of the quiet, terrifying moments that truly define Rewind History Calls, the unsung heroes and the bizarre twists of fate, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. We'll keep digging up super thrilling world history stories that will keep you wanting more.